The strangest thing about watching a powerful man break down is realizing nobody stops to ask if he's okay. Rain slid down the glowing neon signs of Broadway like melting paint, turning the streets of Manhattan into streaks of red, gold, and electric blue as Lucy Morgan pulled her jacket tighter around herself and hurried past the nearly empty theater district. It was close to midnight, cold enough to sting her cheeks, and her sneakers splashed through shallow puddles as steam curled from subway grates beneath the sidewalk. Her fingers smelled faintly like charcoal and acrylic paint after spending the entire afternoon sketching tourists in Times Square for tips that barely covered dinner. The city moved around her without noticing her existence, taxis rushing past, strangers staring into phones, umbrellas colliding in silence. New York had a talent for making lonely people feel invisible. Lucy adjusted the worn leather strap of her portfolio bag against her shoulder and checked the crumpled bills in her pocket. $23.70. That was all she had left until next Friday. Rent was already 4 days late. Her landlord had taped another warning notice to her apartment door that morning, and the memory still sat heavy in her chest. She exhaled slowly, watching her breath disappear into the rain-soaked night. One more portrait commission tomorrow. Maybe 2 if tourists were generous. Maybe that would buy her time. A gust of wind swept down the block, carrying the distant sound of a siren and the smell of roasted nuts from a street cart shutting down for the night. Lucy lowered her head and turned onto a quieter side street behind the old Winter Garden Theater, planning to cut through the alley toward the subway entrance when she suddenly slowed. Someone was sitting on the curb beside an overflowing dumpster. At first, she almost kept walking. In New York, people learn not to stare, not to stop, not to get involved. But something about him made her hesitate. The man wore an expensive black suit soaked dark with rainwater, the fabric too tailored, too perfect to belong on someone sitting alone in an alley at midnight. One polished dress shoe rested crooked against the curb, while the other tapped weakly against the pavement like he had forgotten it was moving. His elbows rested on his knees, one hand gripping the back of his neck, the other hanging loosely at his side with streaks of blood smeared across the knuckles. Not fresh, just enough to suggest he'd punched something hard earlier. His phone kept vibrating beside him on the wet concrete, lighting up every few seconds with the same message flashing across the screen. "Where are you, Adrian?" Lucy stopped completely. Rain dripped from the fire escape overhead, ticking softly against metal. The man didn't notice her at first. His head remained lowered, shoulders trembling once as he dragged in an uneven breath. Then she realized something that made her chest tighten unexpectedly. He wasn't drunk. He was crying. Not loud, not dramatic. Just the quiet, exhausted kind of crying people did when they thought nobody was left to see it. A black SUV rolled slowly past the mouth of the alley before disappearing down the block again. The man suddenly looked up toward the street with panic in his eyes, and for one sharp second Lucy caught a glimpse of who he must have been before tonight. Strong jaw, dark hair damp against his forehead, the kind of face that belonged on magazine covers and business billboards. But whatever confidence once lived there had been hollowed out completely. His eyes looked destroyed. Lucy swallowed. "Hey," she said softly. "Are you okay?" The man laughed once under his breath, the sound empty and humorless. "Do I look okay?" His voice was low and rough, like he hadn't spoken in hours. Lucy glanced down at the vibrating phone again. Another call lit up the screen. Then another. The name repeated over and over. Ethan ignored all of them. "You're bleeding," she said carefully. He looked down at his hand like he'd forgotten it existed. "It's nothing." Rainwater slid down his face as he leaned back against the brick wall behind him and closed his eyes for a second. "Please," he murmured quietly. "If anyone asks." "You didn't see me." Lucy frowned. Who would ask? Before he answered, headlights swept briefly across the alley entrance again. The black SUV had returned. The man immediately stiffened. Real fear flashed across his face this time. Not fear of getting hurt. Fear of getting found. He reached for the phone on the ground and powered it off completely before shoving it into his pocket with shaking hands. Then he looked directly at Lucy for the first time. "Please," he said again, his voice barely above the rain. "Don't let them find me tonight." Something about the way he said it made the entire city suddenly feel colder. Lucy glanced nervously toward the mouth of the alley as the black SUV slowed again near the curb before finally continuing down the avenue. its headlights fading into the rain like searching eyes giving up for the night. The man sitting against the brick wall released a breath so shaky it almost sounded painful. Water dripped steadily from his dark hair onto the shoulders of his ruined suit jacket, and for a moment neither of them spoke. Somewhere farther down the block, a subway train thundered beneath the pavement, rattling the loose metal lid of the dumpster beside them. Lucy tightened her fingers around the strap of her portfolio bag. Every instinct told her to leave. New York taught people to protect themselves first. Strange men in alleys at midnight usually came with stories you did not want attached to your name. But another gust of cold wind swept through the narrow street, and she saw him shiver hard enough to make his teeth clench. He looked exhausted. Not physically tired. Hollow tired. The kind that settled deep behind someone's eyes after too many sleepless nights. "You cannot stay out here," she said quietly. The man laughed under his breath again, without humor. "I do not exactly have a lot of options right now." Lucy hesitated. "Do you need a hospital?" No, his answer came too quickly. "No hospitals." Another pause. Rain tapped steadily against the fire escape above them. Lucy crouched slightly, trying to see his face more clearly beneath the shadows. "Then at least let me clean your hand." He looked down at the faint streak of dried blood across his knuckles, as if noticing it for the first time. "I punched a wall," he admitted quietly. Turns out walls usually win. Something about the honesty of the answer caught her off guard. Most men tried to sound tougher when they were hurting. This one sounded defeated. Lucy reached into her bag and pulled out a small packet of tissues along with the half-empty bottle of water she carried everywhere. "Here," she said gently. "Hold still." For a second, he looked like he might refuse, pride flickering briefly across his face, but then his shoulders sagged again. Lucy knelt beside him carefully, pouring a little water over the cuts on his hand while city lights shimmered across the wet pavement around them. Up close, he smelled faintly like expensive cologne buried beneath rain and exhaustion. His suit alone probably cost more than 3 months of her rent, yet right now he looked like someone who had nowhere left to go. "What is your name?" she asked softly. He stayed silent long enough that she thought he might not answer. Then finally, almost reluctantly, he said, "Adrian." "Lucy." He nodded once, but did not repeat her name. His eyes remained fixed somewhere beyond the alley, distant and unfocused, like part of him was still trapped inside whatever had happened earlier tonight. Lucy dabbed the tissue carefully against his scraped knuckles. "Those people looking for you," she said cautiously. "Are you in trouble?" Adrian stared at the rain sliding down the sidewalk. "Depends who you ask." That does not sound reassuring. A faint smile almost appeared at the corner of his mouth before disappearing again. "It is probably not supposed to." Lucy sat back slightly, crossing her arms against the cold. Her apartment was only a 15-minute subway ride away, but even thinking about going home made her stomach tighten. Home meant another notice taped to her door, another voicemail from her landlord, another dinner made from instant noodles because groceries had become a luxury this month. She glanced at Adrian again. Somehow, despite the obvious differences between them, she recognized the same expression she saw in her own mirror lately. The look of someone trying very hard not to fall apart in public. A taxi splashed through the intersection nearby. The city kept moving. It always did. "You can crash at my place for one night," Lucy heard herself say before she could reconsider it. Adrian blinked at her slowly. "That is a terrible idea." "Probably. You do not even know me. You look too tired to murder anybody." For the first time, an actual laugh escaped him. Short and rough, but real enough to surprise both of them. Lucy shrugged lightly. "Besides, if you stay out here, you are going to freeze." Adrian rubbed a hand over his face, hesitation flickering across his expression. Whatever life he came from, accepting help clearly was not something he knew how to do. "I cannot stay long," he said finally. "I just need somewhere they will not think to look." "You keep saying they." His jaw tightened slightly. "People who used to work for me." Lucy frowned but decided not to push further. "Not yet." She stood and adjusted her bag over her shoulder before offering him her hand. After a moment, Adrian took it. His palm was cold from the rain. When he rose to his feet, Lucy realized how tall he actually was, easily over 6 feet, broad-shouldered even beneath the soaked jacket. The alley suddenly felt smaller around them. Another black SUV turned onto the next block over. Adrian noticed it immediately, tension snapping through his body again. Lucy looked at him carefully. "Okay," she said quietly. Now I definitely think we should leave. They started walking quickly toward the subway entrance, rain soaking through Lucy's sleeves while distant thunder rolled across the Manhattan skyline. Beside her, Adrian kept his head lowered beneath the hood of the old gray sweatshirt she had pulled from her bag for him moments earlier. It was oversized on her, but barely fit him, the sleeves stopping awkwardly above his wrists. Still, when she handed it to him back in the alley, something in his expression had shifted for half a second, like nobody had offered him something simple and human in a very long time. As they disappeared down the subway stairs together, neither of them noticed the black SUV, slowing once more at the corner they had just left behind. The downtown subway platform smelled like wet concrete, burnt coffee, and cold iron as Lucy and Adrian stepped onto the nearly empty train just before the doors slid shut behind them. Fluorescent lights flickered faintly overhead while the old car rattled forward with a tired metallic groan. Only 3 other passengers sat scattered across the seats, each wrapped inside their own silent world, headphones on, eyes lowered, nobody paying attention to the tall man in a gray hoodie sitting beside a struggling artist with paint under her fingernails. Lucy pulled her damp jacket tighter around herself and glanced sideways at Adrian. He sat stiffly near the window, shoulders tense every time the train slowed at another station. Even now, after leaving the alley behind, he still looked like someone waiting for disaster to catch up to him. Rainwater darkened the sleeves of the sweatshirt she had given him, and the expensive white dress shirt underneath was wrinkled badly, one button missing near the collar. It was strange seeing someone who obviously belonged in penthouses and black cars sitting under flickering subway lights like this. "You can relax a little," Lucy said softly. "Nobody is hunting you down in a movie scene." Adrian stared at the dark tunnel outside the window. "You would be surprised." Lucy raised an eyebrow, but let it go. The train rocked gently beneath them as they passed beneath the city, the sound of steel against steel humming through the car. For several minutes, neither of them spoke. Lucy studied him carefully instead. He looked older up close now that the panic had settled slightly. Not old exactly, just worn down in a way that had nothing to do with age. There were faint shadows beneath his eyes, the kind sleepless nights left behind, and a small streak of gray near his temple that probably had not existed a year ago. Yet despite the exhaustion clinging to him, there was still something undeniably sharp about him. Controlled, like even broken. He was used to being the person everyone listened to in a room. "So," Lucy said finally, breaking the silence, "what do people usually call you when they are not chasing you through Manhattan in the rain?" Adrian looked at her for the first time since boarding the train. A faint tired smile touched his face. "Adrian is fine. Only fine. At the moment, yes." She shook her head softly. "You talk like somebody in an old black and white movie. I have been accused of worse." Another tiny smile appeared, then vanished just as quickly. Lucy leaned back against the plastic seat and studied the subway map overhead. "You do not have to tell me what happened tonight," she said after a moment. "But whatever it is, you look like you have not slept in days." Adrian rubbed a hand across his jaw slowly. "I probably have not. Bad breakup. Something like that. Work?" His expression darkened almost instantly. "Definitely work." Lucy nodded like she understood. Truthfully, she did understand more than he probably realized. Different worlds. Same exhaustion. Her entire month had become one long apology to people she owed money to. Student loans, rent, utility bills. Every day lately felt like trying to stay afloat while concrete blocks hung from her ankles. But Adrian looked like he had drowned already and somehow kept walking anyway. The train slowed again near Canal Street. A businessman entered carrying a leather briefcase and sat at the far end of the car without glancing at either of them. Adrian instinctively lowered his head slightly beneath the hood. Lucy noticed immediately. "You really think somebody is looking for you?" "I know they are." "Why?" He stayed quiet for so long she thought he might ignore the question entirely. Then finally he spoke, his voice low enough that the rumble of the train nearly swallowed it. "Because tonight a lot of very powerful people lost something they wanted." Lucy frowned slightly. "And what did they want?" Adrian let out a hollow breath. "Control." The answer settled heavily between them. Lucy did not push further. Something told her whatever world Adrian came from was much larger and more dangerous than she first assumed. But there was also something else underneath all of it. Grief. Not fear alone. Loss. The subway lights flickered briefly overhead as the train curved sharply downtown. Adrian leaned his head back against the window and closed his eyes for a moment. Lucy noticed his hand tightening unconsciously around the sleeve of the gray hoodie she had lent him earlier. The fabric looked strangely out of place on him, soft and worn compared to the expensive watch still hanging loosely from his wrist. She glanced at the watch accidentally and nearly choked when she recognized the brand. Even secondhand, it was worth more than everything inside her apartment combined. Adrian followed her eyes and immediately pulled the sleeve lower to cover it. "Sorry," he muttered quietly. "I forgot to take it off." Lucy blinked. "That watch probably costs more than my student debt. It used to belong to my father." The way he said it made her stomach tighten unexpectedly. Not boastful, not proud, just sad. Another silence settled between them before Lucy finally smiled faintly. "Well, congratulations. You are officially the richest man who has ever ridden the downtown C train." Adrian surprised her again by laughing softly beneath his breath. This time the sound lasted a little longer, warm enough to almost resemble the person he might have been before tonight shattered him. The train screeched into her stop 20 minutes later. Lucy stood, adjusting her portfolio bag again. "Come on," she said gently. "My apartment is not fancy, but the roof only leaks in one corner now." Adrian hesitated before standing beside her. As the subway doors opened, cold air swept through the train car again, carrying the distant smell of rain and street food from above ground. Lucy stepped onto the platform first, but halfway toward the stairs, she realized Adrian had stopped walking. She turned back. He stood frozen near the yellow safety line, staring at a massive digital billboard mounted above the station entrance television. The screen flashed breaking news in bright red letters while a photograph appeared beneath it. A sharply dressed version of Adrian stared back at them from the screen beside the words, "Hale Industries CEO vanishes after boardroom collapse." Lucy slowly looked from the television to the exhausted man standing 10 feet away from her in the gray hoodie. And for the first time that night, she realized she had not brought home an ordinary stranger at all. Lucy stared at the television screen above the subway platform while the breaking news banner flashed over Adrian's photograph again and again in bright red letters. The man on the screen looked nothing like the exhausted stranger standing a few feet behind her in an oversized gray hoodie. Television Adrian Hale looked untouchable. Sharp navy suit, perfect posture, cold billionaire eyes beside headlines worth billions of dollars. But the real Adrian standing under the flickering station lights looked like someone barely holding himself together. "Oh my God," Lucy whispered before she could stop herself. Adrian closed his eyes briefly, almost like he had expected this exact moment from the second she invited him onto the train. Around them, commuters continued moving through the station without paying attention. A teenager walked past eating pretzels. A tired nurse adjusted her scrubs near the stairs. Nobody realized one of the richest men in New York was standing in a subway station trying not to be recognized. Lucy looked back at the screen again as the reporter continued speaking. "Following a shocking emergency board vote tonight, billionaire founder Adrian Hale has reportedly disappeared after losing executive control of Hale Industries, one of the largest technology firms in the country." Sources close to the company described the situation as catastrophic. Adrian reached up and pulled the hood lower over his face before quietly stepping away from the television. "We should keep moving," he said softly. Lucy blinked hard and hurried after him toward the stairs leading up to street level. Cold rain still drizzled over Manhattan when they emerged from the station several minutes later. The sidewalks glistened beneath streetlights while delivery trucks rumbled through narrow downtown streets. Lucy's apartment building sat 3 blocks away above a laundromat that smelled permanently like detergent and overheated metal. She walked slightly ahead of Adrian now, her mind racing faster with every step. She knew who Adrian Hale was. Everybody did. His face appeared on magazine covers in grocery stores beside headlines about billion-dollar acquisitions and revolutionary technology projects. There had even been rumors last year that he might run for mayor someday. He was one of those men who existed behind glass skyscrapers and television interviews. Men like him did not end up crying in alleys. Yet beside her, Adrian walked silently with his hands buried deep in the pockets of the hoodie she had lent him, shoulders hunched against the rain like any exhausted stranger trying to survive another hard night. Lucy slowed slightly. "You could have told me," she said carefully. Adrian gave a faint, humorless smile without looking at her. Would it have changed your mind? She thought about it honestly. If she had recognized him in that alley, she probably would have assumed bodyguards were nearby. Lawyers, drivers, assistants. Not a man completely alone. I do not know, she admitted quietly. Exactly. His voice carried no anger, just exhaustion. They reached her building moments later. The flickering neon sign of the laundromat painted soft blue light across the wet sidewalk, while warm air smelling like soap drifted through the open front door downstairs. Lucy unlocked the narrow side entrance beside the laundromat and led Adrian up 3 flights of old stairs that creaked loudly beneath every step. Halfway up, the ceiling leaked steadily into a bucket someone had placed in the hallway weeks ago. Adrian glanced at it briefly. Luxury living, Lucy said dryly. Very exclusive. To her surprise, another quiet laugh escaped him. It was becoming easier now, she noticed. Smaller, softer, less forced. By the time they reached her apartment door, Lucy suddenly became painfully aware of how small the place actually was. She pushed the door open nervously. Warm yellow light spilled across the tiny studio apartment. The room smelled faintly like paint, coffee, and vanilla candles burned too often to cover old radiator heat. Sketches covered almost every wall, some framed neatly, others taped carelessly beside the windows. A second-hand couch sat across from a tiny kitchen area barely large enough for one person to cook in comfortably. Canvases leaned against corners. Paintbrushes rested inside old coffee mugs near the sink. Adrian stepped inside slowly, looking around without speaking. Lucy kicked off her wet sneakers awkwardly. It is not much, she muttered. Actually, Adrian's voice softened slightly as he studied the sketches covering the walls. It feels more alive than my penthouse ever did. Lucy glanced at him in surprise. He removed the hoodie carefully and draped it over the back of the couch, like it was somehow more valuable than the $1,000 suit still underneath it. For a second, he simply stood there taking in the apartment quietly. The small kitchen light. The stack of unpaid bills on the counter Lucy had forgotten to hide. The half-finished charcoal portrait resting near the window. The old record player beside the bookshelf. None of it impressive. None of it polished. Yet something in Adrian's face eased slightly for the first time since she met him. Like stepping inside this tiny imperfect apartment had allowed him to breathe again. Lucy moved awkwardly toward the kitchen. I can make ramen, she offered. That is basically the fanciest thing I own right now. Adrian loosened his soaked dress, shirt collar slowly. Honestly, Lucy, he looked around the room once more before meeting her eyes. That sounds better than any 5-star restaurant on earth tonight. She smiled faintly despite herself and filled a pot with water while rain tapped softly against the windows behind them. Across the room, Adrian sat carefully on the couch, leaning forward with his elbows resting on his knees. His eyes drifted toward a framed pencil sketch hanging near the bookshelf. It showed an older woman laughing with wind blowing through her hair. Your mother? He asked quietly. Lucy nodded while turning on the stove. She passed away 3 years ago. Adrian stared at the drawing a moment longer. You captured her happiness. Lucy looked down at the steaming pot slowly. I was trying to remember it. Silence settled softly between them after that. Not awkward this time. Just tired. Human. The kind of silence shared between two people who had both lost more than they admitted aloud. Then suddenly Adrian's phone buzzed sharply from inside his pocket. He froze instantly. The sound cut through the apartment like broken glass. Lucy turned toward him as his expression darkened again. Slowly, reluctantly, Adrian pulled the phone out and stared at the screen. One unread message glowed brightly in the dim apartment light. We know you are not alone. The soft, bubbling sound of ramen simmering on Lucy's tiny stove filled the apartment while rain continued tapping gently against the windows. But the warmth that had briefly settled between them disappeared the moment Adrian read the message glowing on his phone screen. His face went completely still. Not shocked. Not angry. Worse. Resigned. Lucy slowly lowered the wooden spoon in her hand. What does that mean? She asked quietly. Adrian kept staring at the screen for another second before locking the phone and slipping it face down onto the couch cushion beside him. It means I should not have come here. He stood immediately, running a hand through his damp hair as tension returned to every inch of his body. Adrian. Lucy. Listen to me carefully. His voice stayed calm, but she could hear the pressure underneath it now. You were kind to a stranger tonight. That is all this should have been. If people around me think you are involved in any way, involved in what? She interrupted softly. Adrian stopped pacing. The apartment suddenly felt too small for whatever invisible storm had followed him inside. He glanced toward the rain-streaked windows before speaking again. Tonight was not just some executive disagreement. The board forced me out of my own company. Lucy leaned against the kitchen counter quietly, watching him. Companies replace executives all the time. Adrian laughed once beneath his breath, but there was no humor in it. Not like this. He loosened the cuff of his expensive dress shirt slowly, like even the fabric irritated him now. 3 months ago, Hale Industries was worth $40 billion. Last week, we finalized a defense contract that would change the entire company. Tonight, my own board accused me of financial instability and voted me out before the deal closed. Lucy frowned. And you think somebody is after you because of money? Adrian looked at her carefully. Lucy, people have destroyed families over far less than $40 billion. Silence settled heavily between them. The ramen boiled quietly behind her, while distant sirens echoed somewhere far downtown. Lucy stared at him for a moment longer before finally crossing the room and turning the stove down lower. You still need to eat. Adrian blinked slightly, almost confused by the response. That is your concern right now? You look like you are about 5 minutes away from collapsing. Another pause. Then surprisingly, some of the tension in his shoulders eased again. Not completely, just enough for exhaustion to become visible beneath it. Lucy grabbed 2 mismatched bowls from the cabinet above the sink and carried them carefully to the tiny table beside the window. Sit, she said gently. Unless billionaires are too fancy for instant noodles. Adrian stared at her for a second before finally sitting across from her at the tiny wooden table. The apartment light cast soft gold shadows across his tired face, while steam curled upward between them from the ramen bowls. For a while, neither of them spoke. Adrian simply held the warm bowl between his hands like he had forgotten what normal human evenings felt like. Lucy watched him carefully from across the table. It was strange. Earlier that night, she had seen a broken stranger in an alley, then a billionaire on a television screen. But sitting here now in her tiny apartment, with wet hair and borrowed clothes, Adrian somehow looked more real than either version. So, Lucy said softly after a few minutes, what happens now? Adrian gave a faint, tired smile without looking up. Honestly, yes. I have absolutely no idea. The honesty of the answer surprised her more than anything else tonight. Powerful men were supposed to sound certain. They were supposed to have plans, solutions, control. But Adrian looked down at the noodles in front of him like someone who had lost the map to his own life. My father built Hale Industries from nothing, he said quietly after another moment. One office. For employees. He used to tell me the company was never about technology. It was about trust. Lucy listened silently. Adrian stared out the rain-covered window beside the table. After he died, I spent 15 years turning it into one of the biggest companies in the country. His jaw tightened slightly. And tonight, I realized half the people around me were just waiting for the right moment to take it away. Lucy lowered her eyes to the steam rising from her bowl. People disappoint you when money gets involved. Adrian looked at her carefully. You say that like experience. She smiled faintly without humor. My father borrowed money from relatives when his construction business collapsed. Funny thing about people. They call you family until repayment gets late. Adrian watched her quietly after that. Something softer flickered briefly across his face. Recognition, maybe. Shared loneliness. Lucy took another bite before speaking again. For what it is worth, I think your company is stupid. Adrian blinked in surprise. Excuse me. Not your company exactly. Just the whole billionaire world. She gestured vaguely with her chopsticks. Private jets. Glass offices. People pretending money makes them important. To her surprise, Adrian smiled for real this time. Small but genuine. And here I thought you invited me over because you admired my business empire. Please. I barely pay my electric bill. The laugh that escaped him then sounded warmer than before. Less broken. Lucy realized suddenly it might have been the first normal conversation he had experienced in weeks. No reporters. No lawyers. No executives trying to manipulate him. Just cheap ramen in a cramped apartment while rain hit old windows outside. Adrian glanced around the room again, eyes settling briefly on the scattered sketches leaning against the walls. You drew all these? Lucy nodded. Mostly subway portraits and freelance commissions. He stood slowly and walked toward a charcoal sketch resting beside the bookshelf. It showed an elderly man asleep on a subway bench beneath fluorescent lights. The expression on the man's face looked painfully real. Adrian studied it quietly. You notice things most people ignore, he said softly. Lucy shrugged awkwardly. That is what artists do. Adrian turned toward her slowly. No. Most people look at strangers and see inconvenience. You looked at a man crying in an alley and saw a human being. His voice had lowered almost to a whisper by the end of the sentence. The apartment suddenly felt very still around them. Rain against glass. Steam rising from forgotten ramen bowls. The soft hum of the old refrigerator in the corner. Lucy looked down quickly, strangely aware of how close he stood now. Then suddenly a pair of headlights swept across the apartment ceiling through the rain-covered windows outside. Adrian froze instantly. Every trace of warmth vanished from his face. Slowly, carefully, he stepped toward the window and pulled the curtain aside just enough to look down onto the street below. A black SUV sat parked across from the laundromat. The black SUV remained parked across the street beneath the pale glow of a flickering street lamp, while rain slid slowly down its dark windows like melting shadows. Lucy stood frozen near the kitchen table, watching Adrian's expression change completely. Every trace of warmth that had existed moments earlier disappeared behind something colder. Sharper. Not panic exactly. Instinct. The kind built from years of surviving rooms where trust could vanish overnight. Adrian lowered the curtain carefully and stepped away from the window without speaking. Lucy swallowed. Do you think they found you? Adrian rubbed a hand slowly across his jaw before answering. I do not know. That does not sound comforting. His eyes moved toward the apartment door automatically, measuring distance, exits, possibilities. It struck Lucy suddenly how exhausting his life must have become if even silence felt dangerous to him. Listen, he said quietly. If anybody knocks, you do not know me. You met someone downtown for 5 minutes. That is all. Lucy crossed her arms. You really think I am going to throw you into the street right now? Adrian looked at her carefully, and for a second the exhaustion in his face returned stronger than before. No, he admitted softly. That is actually the problem. The words settled unexpectedly deep in her chest. Rain continued tapping softly against the windows while headlights from passing cars drifted across the ceiling above them. Lucy walked slowly toward the window herself this time and peeked through the curtain. The SUV remained motionless across from the laundromat. Engine running. Waiting. Maybe they are not here for you, she whispered. Adrian gave her a tired look. Lucy, men in black SUVs are always here for me. Despite everything, she laughed quietly beneath her breath. Adrian blinked once, almost surprised she still could. What? She asked lightly. Nothing. A faint smile touched his face again. I just forgot what normal people sound like. Lucy turned from the window and leaned against the radiator near the couch. I'm not sure I count as normal. Adrian glanced around the apartment once more, eyes drifting over the scattered sketches and half-finished canvases leaning against the walls. You live in a 500-square-foot apartment over a laundromat and still manage to laugh at midnight while a billionaire meltdown plays on national television. His voice softened slightly. That feels pretty extraordinary to me. Lucy looked away quickly before he noticed the color warming her cheeks. She walked toward the sink instead, rinsing the ramen bowls slowly beneath warm water. Behind her, the apartment fell quiet again. No television, no phone calls, no board members screaming through conference rooms. Just the low hum of old pipes and rain against glass. After a moment, she realized Adrian had not moved. He still stood near the couch, staring vaguely at the floor like his mind was somewhere far away. You can sit down, you know, she said gently. Nobody is making you earn shelter points. Adrian exhaled softly and finally lowered himself onto the couch again. The gray hoodie still rested folded neatly beside him. Lucy noticed the way his fingers brushed across the sleeve unconsciously before he leaned back against the cushions. Do you want to know the worst part? He asked quietly after several moments. Lucy turned off the faucet and looked toward him. About tonight. Adrian nodded faintly. I knew it was coming. She frowned slightly and sat down in the armchair across from him. Then why did it still hit you so hard? Adrian stared toward the rain-covered window. Because sometimes you spend so many years building something that you forget who you are without it. His voice had gone lower now, quieter. Honest in a way powerful men rarely allowed themselves to be. My entire life became that company. Every relationship, every decision, every morning. He smiled faintly without humor. Then one vote later, suddenly you walk outside and realize you do not actually know where home is anymore. Lucy listened silently. Something about the sentence hurt more than she expected. Home is not where you sleep, she thought. It is where someone waits for you. And judging by the emptiness in Adrian's eyes, nobody had waited for him in a very long time. My mother used to say success is dangerous, Lucy said softly after a moment. Adrian glanced toward her. Why? Because eventually people stop asking if you are happy. They only ask if you are winning. Adrian stared at her quietly. Then slowly, almost reluctantly, he nodded. Your mother sounds wise. Lucy smiled faintly. She was a waitress from Queens who smoked too much and threatened parking officers for fun. For the first time that night, Adrian laughed hard enough that the sound filled the tiny apartment warmly. Real laughter this time. Tired, rough around the edges, but undeniably real. Lucy found herself smiling too. It felt strange how quickly the distance between billionaire and stranger kept disappearing whenever he forgot to guard himself. Outside, thunder rolled softly somewhere beyond the skyline. Adrian leaned his head back against the couch cushion and closed his eyes briefly, exhaustion finally pulling at him openly now. Without the tension constantly tightening his shoulders, he suddenly looked less like a powerful executive and more like a man who had not rested in weeks. Lucy studied him quietly from